Further exacerbating the entire situation was how the American banking system itself really struggled and collapsed. Over 9,000 banks would go bankrupt in the years after Black Tuesday. And when banks went bankrupt or closed, that would cause the money supply to shrink. And when money is in short supply, that means fewer people have access to loans and how they need it, which means that they would have less purchasing power, which means that they're not buying as much stuff. They're not taking out loans. When that happens, that causes deflation, a devaluation in the dollar. That sort of a thing is disastrous for an economy. So, other things would also happen to try and circumvent some of the issues. Manufacturers and merchants tried to slash prices and cut back on hours. They tried to cut back on production. They would lay off workers. So you saw a massive rise in unemployment, which we'll talk about in more detail here in a little bit. They'd cut back on production. There's just not as much money to go around. And because there's not as much money to go around, the value of things becomes less. So, for example, in 1929, before the stock market crashed that Black Tuesday, the American gross domestic product was roughly about $104 billion. You consider what America's GDP is today in the 20s of billions, that was significant for that time. $104 billion. In a matter of 3 years, it had shrunk down to only $76 billion. It lost a quarter of its entire worth. The entire gross domestic product, all the things that are manufactured, all the money, all the banking, all the jobs, everything, lost a quarter within a span of 3 years. That is disastrous for an economy, especially one that thrives on consumerism as much as the American economy does. Furthermore than that, at various different times, up to 25% of all working age adults were unemployed in the decade of the 1930s. And those that were still working, about half of which were underemployed, which means that they worked for meager wages, or maybe you had a significant education and you were working a job that wasn't up to the standard of your education because there just was no work available. So Americans who had excess in the 1920s really suffered in the decade of the 1930s with unemployment and underemployment.